Hello, I'm Ann Brown, and I am going to tell you the story of my terrible sin and of my apology. I was born in Lexington, South Carolina in 1845, and I was raised out in the country near 12 Mile Creek. Well, now it's 1899. It's almost the turn of the 20th century. I should tell you, I'm not a real person. I'm an imaginary character, and so are my family members and friends. But I'm going to tell you some true history. So when I was a little girl growing up in the 1840s and 50s, my father owned slaves, a couple and their 3 children. And one of the girls, Franny, was about my age, and we looked like each other in some ways. We had the same nose and chin, and we would play together when she wasn't helping her mama. So one Sunday afternoon, Franny and I were playing down by 12 Mile Creek, and she liked to imagine that there were little people down there, and so we would make boats for them out of sticks and put them in the water. And it had been raining that afternoon, and the bank was muddy, and I said, Franny, let's make face paint out of the mud and paint freckles on each other. She said, I don't think we ought to do that, Miss Annie, because we'll get mud on our dresses and our mamas will be mad. I said, don't worry about that. We've got plenty of time to wash off any mud before supper. And so she reluctantly agreed, and we had so much fun painting each other and making boats for the little people that we lost track of time. And we knew it was late when we heard the song of the whippoorwill. And then we heard my mama calling, Annie, where are you? Well, we were in trouble with both of our mamas. But my mother was furious, and she forbade me to ever play with Franny again. And she sent me to my room. And then I heard Franny crying because Mama was spanking her with her hairbrush. Mama never hit me like that, and this was my fault. Well, the next morning, my brothers and I were walking to school, and we passed by Franny's cabin, and they started poking fun at her. They said, Freckled Franny, Freckled Franny. And I saw a big tear roll down Franny's face. And she was staring at me like, why don't you say something? Why don't you stand up for me? But I didn't say anything because I wanted my brothers to like me. And for the rest of our childhood, Franny never looked me in the eye again. And every time I would walk by her cabin, I would feel this twinge of sorrow and guilt. Well, when I was 17, I met my future husband down by 12 Mile Creek. His name was Irvin. And he was fishing down there, and I was walking, and we met, and within a few months, I married him because he was handsome and called me sweetheart. Then a few months after that, he joined the Confederate Army in the war between the states. He said he had to fight for his country. Those times were so hard. I don't even like to remember them. It seemed like we were hungry all the time, and I know the enslaved people were even hungrier. So when Irvin came walking home at the end of the war, everything was sweet for a while. I remember my papa telling Franny's father that they were free now, but that didn't mean they were equal. Just equal to work and not depend on him anymore. And you know, the enslaved people were freed at different times in different places. And I honestly don't remember when that happened in Lexington, but I do remember the joyful sounds of celebration, the laughing and the singing and the shouting. And you know, President Lincoln freed the enslaved people with his Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. But that was just a promise of freedom. The last group of enslaved people weren't freed until June 19th, 1865 in Texas. And they call that day Juneteenth. Well, after that came a time called Reconstruction. And that's when the U.S. Congress integrated these newly freed people into our government and our society in general. And oh my, that was quite a time. I remember my cousin Tom was called a scalawag because he supported the Reconstruction efforts. And he was given a government job for that. But Tom said that about 15% of South Carolinians were scalawags, and they were generally hated by those who sided with the Confederacy. But Tom was educated in a Lutheran school up north, and they were abolitionists, and he was abolitionist. But not all scalawags were. Some were unionists, meaning that they supported preserving the Union, so they disagreed with secession. But Tom had a friend by the name of Simeon Corley, and this is a true story. Simeon was a tailor in Lexington, and before the war he disagreed with secession, but that didn't keep him from being forced into the Confederate Army at bayonet point. And so when he was captured by Union soldiers, he gladly gave the oath of allegiance. And so after the war, he was able to be a representative from Lexington and then later a congressman. And he served alongside men of color. And Simeon believed that everyone should be able to vote, regardless of race, education, or even gender. Well, my husband Irvin did not like Simeon or Tom or scalawags in general. And so we had a big argument about that. He said, "You think those freed slaves ought to vote?" He said, "Pretty soon you're going to be telling me that women ought to vote." And I said, "Well, now that you mention it," and we had a rip-roaring argument. He didn't speak to me for 2 weeks, and I was fine with that. But this was such a wonderful time for people of color because they were able to start their own businesses and farms. And unfortunately, Congressional Reconstruction ended in 1877, and that was pretty hard on them. But they still persevered. And they particularly put a high value on education. And there was a man by the name of Robert Smalls, and this is a true story. Robert Smalls was an enslaved man from Beaufort, South Carolina, and he fought for free public education for all children in South Carolina. And there were so many institutions of higher learning created, and some by women of color, like Benedict Institute was created by Bathsheba Benedict in Columbia, and Elizabeth Evelyn Wright started Denmark Industrial School in Denmark, South Carolina. And there were so many churches and mutual help organizations started by people of color. And I remember there was a tent meeting. It was about 10 years ago now, early 1890s. This is a true story. There was a group of it was in Lexington, and there was a group of people of color who were singing spirituals. And there was a man by the name of Charles Tillman who was helping his father put up the tent for the meeting, and he was a gospel song collector. Well, he liked one song in particular, and so I'm going to sing you the first verse of it. It goes something like this. Oh, this old-time religion, this old-time religion, this old-time religion, it is good enough for me. Well, Charles Tillman liked that song so well that he published it in his book. But lately, times have been really hard for people of color because of the Jim Crow laws and segregation and the terrible lynchings that have taken place. I remember I heard a story about two prisoners in the Lexington jail back in May of 1890. This is a true story. Their names were Charlie and Willie, and their story kind of reminds me of that time that Franny and I got in trouble together. They were in jail together, and Charlie was white, Willie was black, and Willie Leapart was only 17 years old, and he was accused of assaulting a young white woman, which he probably didn't do because the woman's brother said that she was coerced into saying that he did it. But anyway, somehow Willie knew that there was an angry mob outside the jail that night, because Charlie reported later that Willie told him, "Charlie, somebody's after me." And Charlie said, "Who's after you?" And Willie said, "Somebody's after me and gonna lynch me. Stick to me." And Charlie said, "What do I want to stick to you for? I don't want to get killed on account of you." And Willie pleaded with him, "Stick to me." Well, I'm not going to tell you the details of what happened to Willie Leapart that night because there might be small children watching. But you adults know what a lynching is. And Willie Leapart was somebody's son, grandson, brother. And his murders were never convicted, even though there were several eyewitnesses. But now, it's almost the turn of the 20th century. And I wonder what that will bring for people of color, because they seem to be on a very long road to freedom. Yesterday, I was out walking by 12 Mile Creek, and I often go there to pray and reflect on my life, and especially since Irvin died last year. And our marriage wasn't perfect, but we made the best of it. And while I was down at 12 Mile Creek walking, I once again asked God to forgive me for my terrible sin. You see, my sin is that I don't often speak up about injustice when I see it, and I think that makes me part of the problem. And so I ask God to, once again, to help me to do better and to give me some little sign that I'm forgiven. And so I continued to walk along the creek, and in the distance I saw a woman picking up sticks and tossing them in the water. And as I got closer, she looked familiar. That nose and chin. And I said, "Franny, is that you?" And she said, "Annie." Oh my, we had a lot of catching up to do. She told me I can call her Frances now, and that she got married and raised a family and learned how to read and started her own sewing business. And I told her about my life and about how sorry I was for that time that we got in trouble together and that I didn't speak up for her. And She said, "Anne, I forgave you for that a long time ago." And I thanked her and I told her I continued to work on speaking up and that I wish everybody would do that and that the world would be a better place if everyone just practiced simple kindness. And she said, "I know what you mean. And it kind of reminds me of a song that we sang at tent meeting last night. This old time religion, it is good enough for me." Thank you for listening to my story, and always, always celebrate Juneteenth.